Good morning, everyone. Wednesday, the 13th of May. Yesterday, we looked at the incredible encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. Today, in John chapter 9, we'll look at a far more public and therefore controversial encounter in Jerusalem between Jesus, a man born blind, and a whole bunch of other people. So if you haven't read it, I suggest you pause it and read that part of chapter 9 about the blind man, and it'll make a whole lot more sense to you. But you can also just follow along in your Bible as I'm talking about this stuff. Jesus had in chapter 8 a serious run-in with the Jews, which ended up with him making that statement, before Abraham was born, I am. A statement claiming to be God, and they'd wanted to stone him, they were so angry, but he managed to slip away. And it leads into the start of chapter 9, as Jesus is now walking along with his disciples after this clash with the Jews. The first thing that happens is that they pass by a man who was born blind. He was a beggar. He was sitting on the road. It was his only means of getting sustenance, relying on the handouts of other people. And he'd been born, obviously, with some congenital defect. He was blind his whole life. And try and picture the scene in Jerusalem. Obviously, he was sitting in a busy public place, not a side street, where he could get what he needed from the people going by. There were lots of people. It was probably noisy, dusty, hot, a busy place. Now we're going to have a look as we go through the story at the specific people one by one and the reactions to what happened in that place and thereafter, and to get some insights into their true heart and motive. And then that will help us, I believe, with our own heart and motive and the insight into the heart and motive of people round about in relation to Jesus. Remember that I said yesterday that you can't have a real encounter with Jesus and be neutral and unmoved. There's always a response required, whether we like it or not. And that's exactly what happens in this story with all of the people concerned. Each of them responds in a different way, in their own way. And that response tells us something about their hearts and motives. It's fascinating. And here we come back again to this debate as to who Jesus really is, Lord, liar, or lunatic. The question raises itself again and again. So let's start with the first group, right from the beginning of the chapter, the disciples. Walking along with Jesus, they looked at this man and tried to understand why he was blind. They were not interested in the man himself or his condition of blindness, but in the condition that caused the blindness. They raised a theological question of who was to blame. This guy's blind, why? Whose fault is it, was the first thing they asked. Who sinned to cause this? For Jesus, it's not a question of theology, but of compassion and of action. So he immediately just heals him. And of course, we need a healthy theology, and we see that theology growing and progressing in the blind man. But for Jesus, the healing of the person comes first. So we can try to study and, in a sense, interrogate Jesus like the Pharisees did to get an understanding, to get the right theological answer to our questions so that we are intellectually equipped and convinced before we would believe in Jesus. But that's not what Jesus is about. As I said in the last few days, things are often inverted with God. So in this sense, you get the diploma and then you start to study. It's not the other way around. Jesus wants to heal us spiritually. He wants our spiritual eyes to be opened first, and then we learn and grow in our theology. Then we can start to study and develop. So like with the woman at the well, the disciples were essentially disconnected from the reality of the situation. And we too can go through life oblivious and unconcerned about the difficulties and struggles of people all around us. Number two, the neighbors. The neighbors, however, were skeptical. They knew this blind man, but they didn't recognize him at first. Who would believe that the same adult man that they'd known for years and years and years was suddenly walking around with his sight restored? It's a miracle, and the reality is people are very skeptical of miracles, yet here he was, undeniably in front of them, seeing. And the blind man settled the confusion by saying, yes, it's me. I was blind, now I see. Now, interestingly, they don't go looking for Jesus, who had done this extraordinary thing. What would you do? Wouldn't you go and say, take me to him. I want to know this guy. I want to see this guy. They take the man to the Pharisees, probably because it had happened on a Sabbath, and they were afraid of what the religious authorities would say. It was forbidden to do any kind of work on the Sabbath. And interestingly, kneading was one of their supplementary laws. You couldn't knead anything. You couldn't knead dough. And Jesus kneaded mud and water, mud and spit to form a paste. So he was essentially working on the Sabbath. One of the most common attitudes today all around us about Jesus is skepticism. Firstly, because people are not comfortable facing the real questions about who Jesus is. And secondly, they are afraid that it might all be true, and they might be forced into a position where they have to make up their minds about Jesus. And oh my goodness, what would people think? What would people say if I became religious? So there's this fear and skepticism that comes about as a result. And that's evident in the neighbors. So then, number 3, we look at the Pharisees. And what was their reaction? The Pharisees were angry. That reaction, that anger manifested in disbelief, prejudice, jealousy, and outright opposition. They hated Jesus. And all of these reactions happen when the subject of Jesus is raised. People often become angry. There's absolute disbelief, there's prejudice, there's all sorts of, and even outright opposition. And Jesus is hated, isn't he? And these are common reactions of the institutional religious establishment who want to retain the status quo at all costs. And Jesus challenges the status quo in our lives. And this is often the reaction of people. But in this case, specifically, why were they so angry? Here was an amazing and beautiful thing that had happened. And they couldn't deny it. At the end, you'll see through all of this argument, they couldn't say, no, it's not true. They couldn't deny it. They tried to, but they couldn't. It was right in front of them. Well, in opening the eyes of a blind man like this, Jesus was actually fulfilling one of the key messianic prophecies, identifying himself as the Christ. It's various places in Isaiah, but let's look at chapter 42, 6-7. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open the eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. So this is specifically about a promise about the coming Messiah, about the Christ. And here Jesus opens somebody's eyes, a blind man's eyes, and it had never happened in the entire Bible from Genesis up to chapter 9 of John to this point. Even the blind man declared in verse 32, nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind, and the Pharisees had no answer. So Jesus was proving from their own scriptures who he was, and they hated it. They tried everything, but here this man was standing in front of them, undeniably healed. In their opinion, this man, Jesus, could not have been from God because he didn't line up with their prejudices, traditions, and incorrect theology. Jesus had called them in the previous chapter liars and children of the devil. No wonder they hated him. And then finally for today, let's look at the parents. The parents were afraid. They were turned into cowards because of fear of being excommunicated. To be put out of the synagogue was an absolute disgrace, and the religious Pharisees had the power to put them out of the synagogue. And imagine how strong that fear was when their own son, who was now an adult and had spent his whole life blind, was miraculously given his sight by someone called Jesus. They couldn't actually credit Jesus. They were such cowards. We too can actually be scared about what people think of us. Jesus can radically transform the life of someone we know, and we can choose to look the other way for fear of what people might think. The reality is that our society is built on externals, on the image and identity we project, because as humans, we really care so much about what other people think. And because of that, we often end up doing the wrong thing or doing really bad things, just going along with the crowd. And the result of that we can see in history and in society all around us, where whole populations have been swayed and have supported evil regimes and done evil things because they were afraid of opinion, public opinion, and afraid of their own authorities. And in regard to these parents, don't you wonder what happened to them after this event? I wonder if they too followed Jesus, or if they just withdrew into a little hole and stayed there. So tomorrow, let's carry on in chapter 9. I'll look at the blind man and Jesus' part in all of this.